We enter med school with a lot of idealism and optimism and enthusiasm. And then, when you start engaging in the work and you see what is involved, you realize this is really hard, and I'm dealing with some really stressful things, and I'm not necessarily coming out of it unscathed. But part of that messaging that I speak of, that is a part of our role, is to actually try to gently remind people you're doing work that, if you're enabled effectively and you feel supported, has enormous meaning associated with it.
Welcome to Flourishing in Medicine, from Surviving to Thriving. I'm your host, Dr. Mick Krasner, and this podcast is produced by EmPro, a professional medical liability insurance carrier headquartered in New York State. And we're committed through educational programming and peer support to support the physicians that we protect. Today on Flourishing in Medicine, from Surviving to Thriving, I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Ripp, a nationally recognized leader in physician well-being, serving as Senior Associate Dean for Well-Being and Resilience and Chief Wellness Officer at the Icahn School of Medicine in Mount Sinai in New York City. There he leads system-wide efforts to support the flourishing of students, trainees, and faculty. In this rich and hopeful conversation, we explore personal, cultural, and systemic dimensions of well-being, emphasizing the importance of meaning, human connection, psychological safety, and organizational change in helping clinicians flourish in modern medicine. So, welcome to Flourishing in Medicine, from Surviving to Thriving. John, it's just great having you here, such a tower in this field, and I'm really pleased to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thanks. Too kind. The feeling is mutual, and it's a real pleasure.
John, you've become one of, I would say, the national architects of physician well-being work. But before we get into systems and burnout and organizational change, I'd like to begin with where we often begin on this podcast, with the human story underneath the career. You wrote that you were literally born at Mount Sinai, which is where you work. And I'm wondering, did medicine feel inevitable? What drew you toward it? When you were younger, what did you imagine being a doctor actually was like?
It's true. I can't seem to get away from Mount Sinai. I am a New Yorker, born and bred, was born here at Mount Sinai Hospital. Was definitely a different place back then. Well, I do think my interest in medicine was shaped a bit by my interactions, and this is probably not all that unusual, but my interactions with my pediatrician. My pediatrician, though, had his office at the hospital. So there's really not a time I can remember life without sort of, having Mount Sinai in it to some extent. Those are some early years where there was some kind of early kind of connection with medicine, and then, followed kind of a natural proclivity for the sciences, and but also a strong sense of wanting to feel that the work is meaningful, that there is something that at the end of the day, I have this strong sense that I have this strong sense that at the end of the day, I need to be able to say, I did something. And so there was kind of a natural appeal for medicine.
At some point in our childhood growing up, we realize our parents aren't leaving during the day just to get away from us, that there's actually work in the world. And then you mentioned about having meaningful work that was really important to you. Do you have a sense of where that came from? What about your upbringing or something that had you realize that was going to be important to you?
The family that I was born into, had these strong values, and that you do something that's impactful. And we're a close family, always spent time with extended family and marked holiday periods together. And so I think, the idea that you do something meaningful was perhaps linked to family. I think I sort of, that was the nidus of it. And then as I had some early experiences, I spent a summer in high school at Mount Sinai, and, kind of got exposed to medicine. It just kind of clicked for me at that point. But I think it sort of was a combination of those values that, kind of were instilled in me and some early experiences with medicine. But, that strong sense of, meaning and ensuring that there's meaning in the work, is something that we should circle back, because it definitely informs a lot of healthcare worker well-being, and it drives it or erodes it. So first, it was what drew me to medicine as a profession, and then I think has really informed my career choice.
So, with that in mind, and I'd like you to just think about the tension between the ideals of medicine, and then as you got into it further and further, the realities of training and then practicing. I'm wondering, when did physician suffering, we can call it, using sort of the language or the lexicon of the archetype, when did physician suffering stop being an abstract issue to you and became personally meaningful?
Another mentor of mine, has said that you don't need to have cancer to be an oncologist, right? Like, you don't need to have gone through it yourself in order to then, you don't have to be a physician who has suffered in order to recognize that it's something that's happening to be addressed. And it was after residency, a time that often, that perhaps is associated with many as a period of suffering, but certainly not how I think about it. I think it's a time of enormous growth and identity formation, of which, there are many stressful periods. Perhaps some would frame them as suffering, but like many of us, we enter med school with a lot of idealism and optimism and enthusiasm. And then, when you start engaging in the work and you see what is involved, you realize this is really hard, and I'm dealing with some really stressful things, and I'm not necessarily coming out of it unscathed. And I think as I finished residency and was contemplating what I wanted to do with my life, that, I began to learn and I became fascinated with this idea a little bit. And so the draw for me has always been a fascination with the transformation that occurs when you take individuals and they enter into this profession and they come out sort of changed. And that was fascinating to me. Some of that change is quite positive, right? And some of it is a privilege, and some of it can lead to suffering and burnout and all of the negative aspects. So I think it was around that time that it became very real for me.
And one of the ways looking through your bio and the things you have done, I want to start with this program, this initiative that you've been involved in, advancing idealism in medicine, this curriculum that involves a variety of ways of having a conversation with learners and colleagues and staff about this. This phrase, advancing idealism, struck me, because many people in medicine experience, at least recently, and maybe always, but for sure in the time I've been in it, some erosion in idealism or threats to idealism. And I'm wondering, when you got involved in this, began crafting this AIM initiative, advancing idealism in medicine, what were you trying to preserve or protect or build?
Well, I should start by saying that program is kind of part of my origin story, but it also has sunset at this point. But the way I can speak to your question is that also speaks to kind of the history. You've been at this for quite a while as well. I know your work precedes mine, so this will probably resonate a little bit. But we needed sort of an entry point and a way to frame the development of programming to address the challenges that we started to see. And at the time, this is about 20 years ago now, there wasn't, the actually well-being, and physician well-being and healthcare worker well-being, it wasn't really being spoken about. In fact, I can remember early on sort of having a conversation with some other academics in my, senior to me in my very early years. And I said, oh yeah, I'm doing a study. I'm looking at burnout in residents. And they're like, you're doing what? Like, what is this? And like, and now you don't, I mean, in many ways, it's a good thing. You don't need to explain this anymore because it's been so well described. But back then we needed a name to capture some initial efforts to address what was becoming clear as this kind of growing recognition of the suffering, which had in many ways always been there, but beginning to characterize it and demonstrate through study. So we created this program, Advancing Idealism in Medicine, as a way to sort of describe what it was we were trying to do. So, whether it's idealism or well-being, and I actually think a big challenge right now is there's sort of a lexicon crisis. Everybody's using different things to talk about the same thing, or using one word to talk about different things. So, but back then we needed a name for it, and in those early years, it really just created a space, and it was focused primarily on the residents to try to, again, there's this meaning thing again, to try to shine a spotlight on and enhance the opportunities to engage in work that's meaningful. We called it Advancing Idealism. It speaks, the idealism I think of similarly as kind of the enthusiasm that we enter into the profession with, and sort of the excitement around it. And like, I'm gonna save lives, and for a lot of us, there's a real appeal there, but that's also linked to the meaning aspects of the work. That was the way we framed it then. It evolved and morphed into something else. We started doing studies of burnout, and we created sort of a multi-center research group. And then we really started capturing how, sort of following the tide, as more attention was being placed, we could start calling it, a well-being effort, well-being initiative, combating burnout, et cetera.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I really appreciate the frame you put that, that AIM now in some ways has sunsetted. That just speaks to this is an evolution, that things have changed, that now you can talk to a colleague and you don't have to explain what you're doing in burnout because people know what it is. They experience it themselves and have recognized that. I'm wondering what has surprised you most as this field of physician well-being has evolved. How are we talking differently about it now than we were even 10 years ago?
Certainly we don't have to, I'll just build on how we don't need to explain ourselves anymore. So there was a long period, as I'm sure you recall, where we just need to say what it was we were doing. We had to say, yeah, there's this problem, and let me tell you about it. So that's been a big evolution. And what's come with that is the question that naturally follows is, okay, so what are you going to do about it? I think to some extent we are beginning to answer that question. There are activities that individuals can engage in which are good for their own well-being. The elephant in the room, of course, is you got to have time to do that and access to those resources. So I do think we're starting to see, and there's some excitement now around larger system level work environment, work culture changes that not only create the time, but the sort of the normal expectation that you should have the time to engage in activities. And of course, like so many things, even if we didn't do it, the rising generation is demanding it. So, which is a good thing. So, that's an evolution as well. We're at a time now where it's demonstrating the clear links between certain initiatives and the benefits that come, and how to really solidify and create a set of normal standard practices for addressing workforce well-being. That is where we are, I think, where we are now. In addition to this bit about, it's hard to move forward in establishing, these are some of the standard things every institution should do, when there remains a lack of clarity on the term we are using to describe it and what we are actually describing. So we kind of need to, that's where I see us at now, where we've evolved to. We need to get a handle on what the words are and what we're talking about. And then how do you embed that in the fabric of healthcare system, practice, delivery, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I think that's really wise. There's a German philosopher, Wittgenstein, who said something like, or talked about, you can't really enter a world unless you have a language in which everyone is agreeing upon, or some sense of consensual reality around it. So I think that's really useful work, although difficult work to do, because it's bringing all these disparate factions together. I want to explore a little bit more about for me, a subtext to what you just shared with us is this tension in this field that we know, and I think we all would all agree, most would agree that physician distress is largely systemic, driven by systemic cultural, medical cultural factors. Yet the suffering is experienced individually, person by person. Maybe you can just talk about how you think about that tension, and I'll share with you some of the things that I think about. Don't want to have resilience burden physicians that they must master that. Can wellness programs unintentionally protect systems from accountability? I worry about that. And what distinguishes authentic organizational commitment from what I would characterize as performative wellness?
From the standpoint of understanding what works, it's clearly a yes and. It's clearly, we can't just focus on the system and not the individuals working within it. We can't just focus on the individuals if we're not going to address the system that's driving a lot of the stressors. So it's got to be both. But what happens a lot, whether it's getting people together who use different terms or getting people together who are focused in different areas, or quite frankly, how you communicate this, that's oftentimes where the biggest challenge is. If you don't sell it right, so to speak, to whichever constituency you're trying to do the work for, you can very quickly go off the rails. And I can remember a time, you'll appreciate this, early on, where I crafted this presentation where I described sort of the full thickness approach that folded in system level efforts and drivers to address, as well as, individual level resources and tools that individuals can access and benefit. And I made very clear, I said, I'm not suggesting the responsibility is on you as individuals. I'm just saying that if you as individuals have the time to take advantage of these resources, you're likely to be better for it. And I kind of did that. And then I got a question. So you're saying that it's up to us to get ourselves better? I was like, that is not what I'm saying. But it's very easy. And, depending on who you're talking to, and there's a lot of, quite honestly, as you know, there's a lot of anger out there, and it's not misplaced. I think the demands that are placed on physicians and other healthcare workers outstrip their resources and personal and in the workplace. And so that leads to anger, and it's not inappropriate. But sometimes that gets directed at the people that are like myself who are trying to help. And so we also need to have a bit of a thick skin and really refine the ways in which we message. It's really important to communicate this stuff well. I think it's a central skill of any well-being leader whose job it is to care for others. You also talked about concerns about sort of performative, I have the same concerns that an institute, and I think it's not even a concern, it's happening. I mean, there are organizations that, develop wellness efforts, and they say, we're doing it. We got it covered, and it may not really be anything that's going to have significant impact. So there's definitely a concern there, but also that's why we need to kind of just continue to define this and communicate what we believe to be sort of a standard approach. And that does require considerable commitment, because at the end of the day, we're talking about designing the work environment in a way that enables the people working in it to flourish, to really thrive, and not burn out and leave the profession. And that requires a lot of effort and commitment. And if it's just performative and you're just saying, yeah, here's 10% we got our wellness leader here, they do, I spend 10% of their time doing it, and they're not really able to roll out programming and help, drive systemic change, they're set up to fail.
What I find in the literature being written about this are things about psychological safety, our sense of belonging as professionals, moral injury it's just part of practicing medicine, in my opinion, but maybe it's magnified now, human dignity, our own as professionals, and what seems to be threatened by technology in particular and how medicine is organized, the loss of relationality in modern medicine. And in some ways, when I hear you speaking, I'm hearing you talk about really what is essentially a culture change in the medical culture. maybe you can just riff on what does a healthy medical culture actually feel like? And we've all experienced moments you described, even your residency being a positive thing. And I agree, I have the same experience. What is that actually like? What are the components of at least what it's like to be in a healthy medical environment culturally?
Well, for starters, I would say it's easy to go negative, right? And there's the concept of a negativity bias that we're kind of wired that way. And there's a lot of things happening that are negative. So it's easy to go negative, but part of, that messaging that I speak of, that is a part of our role, is to try to gently remind people you're doing work that, if you're enabled effectively and you feel supported, has enormous meaning associated with it. I mean, what else? I do some degree of palliative care in my work, and as hard as it is, I mean, it's a blessing to be invited to participate in this final stage of someone's life and enable them to pass on with some level of comfort. I mean, what that is enormous meaning. So we are really fortunate in that regard. And we have to just make sure, those that are focused on this work, and we can get to whose responsibility is it to enable the well-being of the workforce. A potentially controversial or provocative statement would be that it's actually not the well-being officer or well-being leader, but it's the executive leadership. It's the folks that are really making the shots, calling the shots, that set the culture and enable the work environment to support individuals. So what does the culture look? Well, the culture is one, I think, that in which there's a fair degree of transparency around this, in which there's that we are here to support you. So I'll pick a few of the things you said. When it comes to moral distress, there was a time during COVID where here at our hospital, it never happened, but we were plotting out what are we going to do if we run out of ventilators, and so like that kind of exercise was underway. I mean, talk about moral injury, right? Like having to make those kinds of decisions. So, and to your point, like I think moral distress and perhaps leading to moral injury is to some extent inevitable in our work, because ultimately there's going to be some sort of limitation on, you're going to be put in a situation where you just can't do what you want to do. And so I think it's kind of inevitable, but how you mitigate, maybe it's how do you actually mitigate moral distress from becoming injury? Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the support you feel, the culture that you work in. We saw this in COVID. We saw that if you felt supported by your leadership, it actually buffered the likelihood, mitigated the likelihood of developing symptoms of PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and burnout. So there are ways to, when you're going through a difficult experience, if you're part of a culture that supports you, you can mitigate and maybe even prevent some of these outcomes. And that's through transparency, being leadership presence, enabling, psychological. We just had Amy Edmondson here last week. I mean, there's ways of talking about how do you promote psychological safety, having an environment that's focused on continuously improving, where we're not only continuously improving on the quality of the care we give, but also on the experience of the healthcare worker vis-a-vis, well-being efforts. So I think there's a lot of aspects around a culture. I think it makes all the difference, and we've seen that from some of our data.
Perhaps we can get down to examples of some of these organizational interventions that you've seen actually work, however small they may be. I think our listeners would be interested in them because they are things that actually are working. So anything you could share on that? And maybe, I hate doing this, a two-part question. So something that's really working, and because you interface with so many current and future well-being champions in the world, what are some of the biggest mistakes maybe that institutions make when they're approaching this issue of clinician well-being? So things that work, and what are some mistakes that we want to avoid?
I'll answer the things that work from like both a system and individual level, kind of building off what we were talking about before, where I really believe you need both. So there's a lot of promise and even evidence supporting how novel technologies leveraged at the system level can unload some of the clerical and administrative tasks. I'm speaking specifically to using AI, for example, to help you write your notes. There's a lot of excitement around this right now. These ambient voice scribes that are out there. There's some pretty good emerging evidence to suggest that people who use them, their well-being measures may improve, and that's kind of something that a system can say, we're going to invest in and make it so that you're able to get through the day with less of these clerical tasks. And circling back to meaning, I often will say, it's just about the balance between meaningful tasks and meaningless tasks. And I actually wrote a piece, or co-authored a piece about sort of the difference between avoiding all discomfort and optimizing meaning. There's sort of this idea that, the well-being people, they just want to remove all discomfort from work. That's what's going on here. And that's not what we're trying to do. We're actually trying in some part to, discomfort can be used sort of to refer to just things that annoy you, right? It doesn't have to be a true discomfort. The pebbles in the shoes is the clerical tasks, the jobs that they take 10 minutes to do when it should have taken 2 minutes. All that stuff it's meaningless, right? So it's our job as well-being people are not to just remove every meaningless task from the day, because the truth is that would maybe help a little bit, but it wouldn't solve this problem, because the other element is enhancing the meaning. One of the things we can do is, I think one of the reasons why at a system level these AI tools are working is they remove some of the annoying, just the rote documentation where you have to type, many of which people, would talk about pajama time that would happen at 10 o'clock at night when you finally get a moment to breathe, and then you sit down and you have to write, an hour's worth of notes. So that is a very meaningless element of the work. Some refer to as soul crushing if, it's happening at 10 o'clock. So I think what's great about that is it does both. It helps alleviate some, discomfort, but it also allows you to actually look at the patient in the room and engage with them in a much more meaningful way than you did when you used to be writing at your keyboard and trying to get half your note done because, you don't want to spend 2 hours later finishing your notes. So that, I think, has a lot of promise. And you can use that as one example of a lot of, think about just innovative technologies. We're going to see more of this that's going to help alleviate some of that. So I'm excited about that. Interestingly, that doesn't save a huge amount of time. At least it doesn't seem like it's saving a huge amount of time, but it probably saves some time. And if that time can then allow the individual to engage in activities which are meaningful, which they as individuals identify as meaningful for them, whether it's mindful practice or life coaching, where people meet with an individual who helps guide them, listens to them, understands what really motivates them, mirrors that back to them, asks them questions to get the individual thinking, what do I really want in life, is a very powerful individual level intervention as well that has shown some progress, so some benefit in terms of well-being outcomes. So those are just two examples. Fortunately, we're at a stage now where there's more and more things that you can actually do. So, and those would be part of a kind of a full thickness approach that an institution could take. It requires some resources. So I think answering your other question, what are some things I've seen that have not worked, or where, mistakes made? I think I would probably just go back to an earlier comment, which is if you try to take on a role as a well-being champion or leader or director at an organization and you're either completely under-resourced, and there are things that you can do with limited resources actually, but either under-resourced or you don't really have the support of leadership, where they kind of brought you in as kind of like a checkbox to say we've addressed this, but they don't really actually, so that when you come and you say, like there's this new thing, it's ambient scribes, and here's what it costs, and here's what you can expect from it. And they say, yeah, let's look at this. Let's look at this and then ultimately invest in it. You need leadership support for that. So I don't know if it's a mistake made more so than ways in which programs are set up not to succeed, if I can answer it that way.
Thinking about just a shift, I did want to talk a little bit about your work with this collaborative for healing and renewal in medicine, because I think our listeners will find it interesting what you've learned from that co-founder and co-director, also known as CHARM, which really are these people from all over the country and world to really talk about what the research in burnout and what interventions research are telling us to promote wellness. So if you could just share a little bit about that with the audience, that'd be great.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity, because CHARM has been a real passion project of mine. The history there is that probably about 15 years ago or so now, there were a few of us that were doing some well-being research, and at the time we were focused on resident physicians, and we got to know each other. We were engaged. We were connected in a multi-center survey study, and we realized that we were sort of forming this small community, that it was really nice to have a community. Sometimes this work, I think, can feel lonely, isolating. There's not necessarily a huge group of people that do this work at any given institution. So to be able to have a community where we could connect, exchange ideas, collaborate, work together, share some of the challenges together was really powerful and meaningful. And so that was the beginnings of CHARM. We crafted something that we didn't know where it was going to go, but it kept growing slowly over time, to the point where we realized, and at the time it was just a grassroots kind of volunteer effort. A few years ago now, we kind of got to a point where we said, we should really kind of formally organize and become a nonprofit and have a charter and a board and all that, because we believe we are to some extent, we are a professional society for healthcare well-being leaders. So there's a growing number of people that are making this part of their career. And so having a space to have your professional community and connect with people doing the work, in different places, to find people doing similar activities who you can simply have a learning community with, but also who you can collaborate on projects and also support one another, because the work can be challenging, is what our goal has been. And I think we're doing it. We have quite a lot of members at this point. We have sort of this organizational membership structure where we want an organization to join, and then everyone who's doing well-being work in that organization can get plugged into the different initiatives. So we have different networks based on different well-being positions you might have. We have Chief Wellness Officer network, but we also have, like, for example, if you're focused on residents, we have a GME network. We also have interest groups based on, people doing certain work, whether it's peer support or coaching. And, so we have folks coming together, people that are more focused on mental health, that can really engage on a regular basis. We do some research together. We have webinar series and so forth. So, but yeah, that's kind of how we got from there to here, and it's been wonderful to see that group grow and develop.
John, what conversations are we not having in medicine right now that you think are important for us to begin having?
If, as it relates to our work, it feels like a time where we need to continue to keep the pressure on the momentum, because I for a variety of reasons that are stressing healthcare in general right now, there is some stress on the healthcare worker well-being movement. And so one way I might answer that is, those of us who are doing this work and have been moving it forward, those of us doing it should have conversations where we are saying, how do we keep the pressure moving forward? How do we ensure that this continues on beyond us? And part of that, I think, has to do with some of the things we talked about creating a clear message about what, and a clear description of what it is we're trying to do and how we try to do it, and how organizations, can and should commit, and how doing so is not going to just, add one more priority to a long list of priorities, but actually integrates and can help multiple priorities of healthcare systems and allow systems to flourish as well if we attend to this. So to some extent, I think we need to have those conversations about how do we keep the attention going, but also, and again, I'm choosing to answer this a little bit from the context of how our community, our well-being leadership community, what conversations should we be having? I think we also should be talking about what have we not done that we need to do to continue to make the case, to make sure that we're speaking to all the parties that need to hear from us in a way that makes sense. Because at the end of the day, healthcare systems, there's no money, there's no mission. So they need to understand how, and we need to improve the way in which we can demonstrate that what we do is important to healthcare systems. So I'm not sure I totally answered the way you wanted me to, but that's where I went with it.
Well, no, I think so, because you're talking about sustainability and keeping the pressure moving forward. I think a lot in terms of 20 years ago, the patient safety and quality movement and how that has continued on. And at the time, that was a kind of big radical shift in what medicine paid attention to. And it's had real impact on people's lives and quality of care and safety. And I like to think of the well-being movement for health professionals being very similar. We're kind of at that stage where they were, and that they've been able to keep it going, probably through sustained pressure and through a sustained vision. And you being one who is beginning to craft that vision and keeping that vision crafted in front and center, along with your colleagues in Charm and everywhere else it's been, I think it's possible. So I think you did answer that question. We're going to be winding things down, John, now a bit. And I wanted to just start toward the end with, we've come back to meaning, and you brought it up early on. And I agree, it's a real important component of well-being. What sustains you personally, and how do you protect your own sense of meaning in the work that you do?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one I can speak to is that having that community to connect with and exchange ideas. I find that whenever I'm engaging with people doing the work, it elevates my, fills my cup, so to speak, and helps sustain me. I've seen a lot of positive progress, so I really enjoy opportunities like this and others where I can sort of share the word. I really enjoy that, and that sustains me. It's a little bit harder on the local level because change tends to be really much like quality improvement. Change tends to be incremental, and so it's and if you're embedded in it, it's sometimes hard to see it, but there are times where I'll see some of the benefit of the work that we do locally. We have these champions that each year develop projects based on their departments. And last week, one of these champions shared that some of the work they did in their department, which demonstrated improvement of well-being of their physicians in this case. They then were able to publish it. So even like a double, like they were able to show benefit, and then they were able to generate scholarship. And so that I get a lot of meaning from when I can, sometimes on a day-to-day, it's hard to see, but at moments like that, where you can sort of step back and say, hey, that's, that happened and that, didn't have to happen. So it's meaningful and sustaining to have those moments too. So yeah.
What role can ordinary, and I don't use that in a pejorative sense, I mean in some ways extraordinary because they are, what role can ordinary clinicians play, even if they're not leaders, not formal leaders in this movement?
It's that positivity, negativity thing again, right? Hopefully I conveyed that I get it when people are angry. And I think in many respects, people being the extraordinary, ordinary clinicians that you're referring to, I get that. And when we're trying to make the case to leaders to invest in us and recognize the importance of our own well-being, that they kind of lead. I now have been around enough leaders of healthcare systems to know that it's hard after to just hear that and to get so when leaders are approached with positivity and opportunities, where someone says, hey, I know you're a leader who really cares about this, and here's a way in which we can optimize the well-being of our people and why it's important. I think that's an approach that all of us can take. It's not easy because it requires all the things that rightfully are making us burnt out, angry, stressed, moral distress. But I think that's I think a lot of this is about sort of collectively working on this. It's the healthcare workers and the leaders together. Because my experience has been that healthcare leaders, they know there's a problem and they want to do something about it. They just need to know that they have partners, that they do want to do something to make positive change, and that they're not just going to be yelled at. That's always been my approach. It's not necessarily easy, but yeah, being a part of the solution, being someone who has energy, positivity, and wants to try things.
That's interesting. My father used to say to me, when you move into your life, wherever it goes, if you can think in terms of being part of the solution rather than part of the problem, it's sort of stuck with me. Well, this has been a delightful, inspiring, and I would say meaningful conversation. And I thank you very much. And it's great to have you. If there's anything else you'd like to add for our listeners.
Just that, what a great opportunity for me. And I hope this has been meaningful for your listeners as well. I've been doing this for a while. I know you've been doing it for a while. So we need people we need that next generation, hopefully some of whom are listening, to get charged up and energized, because there's reason for optimism. But we need to maintain our foot on the pedal.
I like the message and I like your energy. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Real pleasure, Mick. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening. We will include a summary of today's podcast and links to Dr. Ripp in the show notes. I'd like to conclude by sharing another practical exercise to help you flourish. And this one may sound a little complicated. It's really not, but just bear with me. I'd like you to start with just taking a few moments to sit comfortably, eyes open, eyes closed. You can stand comfortably if you like. During the podcast, John spoke several times about meaning in work. And at one point he spoke of meaningfulness and meaninglessness. And at a very real level, encountering experience from moment to moment, we don't know what's meaningful and meaningless without bringing awareness online. So today's practice asks us simply, which is actually not so simple, to rest in that awareness and notice our relationships with one of the foundational attitudes of mindful practice, which is judgment. It's really unrealistic to be completely non-judgmental. Impossible. But what we can do is bring awareness to the judging part of our experience and then make choices based on that. So choose an anchor for your awareness, something to settle your attention on, focus your attention on. The breath, some part of the body, something your eyes is gazed upon. And just wait. It won't take long, I promise. Thoughts, feelings, other sensations seemingly suddenly become noticed within that awareness. And then notice the quick, almost immediate judgment that naturally arises. See if you can catch it. It's actually a feature and a consequence of what the ancient contemplatives called Vedana, a term traditionally translated as either feeling or sensation. In general, Vedana refers to pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations that occur when our internal sense organs come into contact with external sense objects and the associated consciousness or awareness of that. Vedana is often identified as valence or hedonic tone in psychological terms. So following that feeling, the Vedana that arises, right on its heels are thoughts, often in the form of judgments. Let's try it again. Just focus on some sense object, the breath, the body, something you're looking at. And notice the intrusion, so seemingly intrusion of thought, feeling, sensations, and then the judgment. Bringing awareness to this process, momentary encounters with sense objects followed by the arising of the Vedanas, and then the thought construction, we can begin to make choices of how we wish to relate to the experience we're having rather than being programmed or on automatic pilot. From this, our whole sense of meaningfulness and meaninglessness can evolve, clarify, motivate us to take the right action. I hope you found this podcast and this brief guided practice useful to you, and look forward to having you join us for the next episode of Flourishing in Medicine, From Surviving to Thriving. To learn more about EmPro, please visit www.myempro.com. EmPro has peer support programs. If you'd like to learn more about that, visit www.myempro.com/peer-support. If you're a physician or a medical student in need of urgent support, consider calling the Physician Support Line, 1-888-409-0141, or visit at www.physiciansupportline.com. It provides a safe space to discuss immediate life stressors with colleagues who are uniquely trained and have similar experiences in this profession. I look forward to seeing you next time.